She was a virgin and innocent and grew up among nuns, without knowing what freedom was. At 22, she was sold and forced to marry an unknown millionaire. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. For 22 years, Eleanor Sanders knew no other world beyond the high walls of St. Clair's orphanage, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. There, among the Sisters of Charity who spoke only when necessary, and days that repeated, like litanies, she grew up believing her life would always follow that routine of morning prayers, work in the garden, and mandatory silence after 6 in the evening. She didn't know that shopping malls existed, or Miami Beach, or the chaotic traffic of New York City. Her universe was limited to the lavender smell of the corridors, the constant sound of rain on the zinc roof, and her hands calloused from embroidering tablecloths for the chapel. The nuns never told her about her origins. They only said she had been left there as a baby on a stormy night by a woman who cried so much that her sobs echoed through the corridors until dawn. Eleanor grew up imagining this unknown mother, creating stories in her head during the embroidery hours. Perhaps she was too young, perhaps she couldn't provide for her, perhaps she loved her so much that she preferred to give her to someone who could take better care of her. She never suspected the truth. Her routine was simple and unchanging. She woke at 5 in the morning with the first bell, attended 6 o'clock mass, had breakfast with dry bread and watery milk, then went to the garden where she cultivated vegetables. That fed the 43 people of the institution. In the afternoon, she embroidered or helped in the kitchen. At night, after the rosary, she lay in the room she shared with 5 other girls and looked through the only window, trying to imagine what existed beyond those mountains shrouded in mist. Eleanor had something different from the others, a quiet magnetism that bothered some of the older sisters. Her brown eyes seemed to hold secrets she herself didn't know, and there was a natural sensuality in her gestures that no amount of prayers could completely erase. At 16, when her body began to transform, the Mother Superior started watching her more closely, as if fearing she might contaminate the other girls with some dangerous restlessness. It was on a March afternoon, when the unusual heat left everyone drowsy, that Eleanor's life changed forever. The Mother Superior called her to her office, a small dark place she rarely entered. There was a man there, dark suit, graying hair, golden glasses. He looked her up and down like someone evaluating merchandise, while the mother explained that this was attorney Arthur Henry Blackwood, representative of a traditional family from Boston. The man spoke with an educated but cold voice about a unique opportunity. The Blackwood family had decided to sponsor her education and her future, in exchange for an agreement that she didn't need to fully understand at that moment. She would be taken to Boston, receive appropriate clothes, refined education, learn to behave in society. In exchange, when she turned 22, she would fulfill a commitment that had been made in her name long before she was born. Eleanor didn't understand, but the prospect of knowing the world beyond those walls filled her with an excitement she couldn't hide. The nuns packed her belongings in an old cloth bag, putting in the few clothes she owned and a small Bible with yellowed pages. There were no affectionate goodbyes, only serious looks and a hasty blessing from the Mother Superior, who seemed to be fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. The car waiting for her was a black BMW with dark windows, driven by a uniformed driver, who didn't say a word during the entire journey. Eleanor pressed her face to the window, seeing for the first time real cities, colorful houses, people walking in the streets, children playing in parks. Each new image made her feel as if she were waking from a very long dream. Boston received her with its deafening noise and its perpetually cloudy sky. The house where she came to live was in Beacon Hill, an elegant townhouse with a well-kept garden, where a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Mitchell took charge of her education. For 3 years, Eleanor learned French, piano, etiquette, art history. She discovered books, films, music. Her world expanded vertiginously, but there was always a strange feeling that she was being prepared for something that nobody wanted to explain properly. On the morning of her 22nd birthday, Eleanor woke with a strange sensation in her chest, as if something important was about to happen. During the 3 years in Boston, she had completely transformed. The shy girl from the orphanage had become a sophisticated young woman who spoke fluent French, played Chopin on the piano, and knew how to behave in any social environment. But still, she felt like an actress playing a role she hadn't chosen. Mrs. Mitchell had prepared a special breakfast with fresh fruits and French bread, but her expression was more serious than usual. After Eleanor finished eating, the housekeeper gave her a heavy envelope sealed with red wax. Inside there was a letter written on letterhead paper and a black and white photograph of a man she had never seen, but who somehow seemed familiar. The letter was signed by Alexander Blackwood, not the lawyer who had picked her up from the orphanage, but his son. The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine, and the words carefully chosen. He explained that the time had come for her to know the truth about her origin and about the commitment that had been made in her name. Her biological mother had been an employee of the Blackwood family more than 20 years ago, and when she became pregnant by the patriarch of the family, she received a considerable sum of money to disappear and never contact them again. The agreement included a clause that Eleanor was unaware of. When the illegitimate daughter turned 22, she would be offered in marriage to the legitimate heir of the family as a way to keep the Blackwood blood pure and concentrate the family inheritance. It was a tradition that had been repeated for generations, an archaic way of preserving the fortune built by the family's ancestors through the tea trade in the 19th century. Alexander wrote that he understood the barbarity of the situation, but that he was also bound by the same ancestral chains that bound her. He had lost his wife 2 years earlier, in a car accident that many whispered had not been accidental, and since then had lived isolated on the family estate in rural Massachusetts, near the town of Stockbridge. He proposed that she go there, see the property and meet him, before making any decision. The photograph showed a man of approximately 35 years, dark hair slightly graying at the temples, intense grey eyes, and a melancholic expression that made Eleanor feel a strange attraction even through the static image. There was something in that face that awakened in her a dangerous curiosity, a desire to know the story behind those sad eyes. Mrs. Mitchell explained that the decision was hers, but that if she refused the agreement, she would lose all the financial support she had received until then and would have to fend for herself in the world. On the other hand, if she accepted, she would become one of the richest women in the country, with access to a fortune estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, properties in Boston, New York, and abroad, as well as a social position that most people only dreamed of having. Eleanor spent the entire day walking around the city, trying to process that devastating information, discovering that she had a living biological father, that her mother had basically been bought off to stay away, that her entire life had been planned by people she didn't even know. She felt betrayed, manipulated, used. But at the same time, there was a part of her that was curious to meet this mysterious man who was also a prisoner of the same family traditions. At night, sitting at the piano in the living room, playing a Beethoven sonata that always calmed her, Eleanor made her decision, not for money or social position, but for an inexplicable need to discover who she really was, where she came from, and why she felt that the man in the photograph held answers to questions she didn't even know she had. The next day, she informed Mrs. Mitchell that she agreed to meet Alexander Blackwood and see his property. The housekeeper seemed relieved, as if she too were fulfilling an obligation she wanted to be free of. In less than a week, everything was organized. A driver would come to pick her up on a Friday morning, and she would spend the weekend at the estate, meeting the man who could become her husband. While packing, Eleanor felt a mixture of fear and excitement running through her veins. For the first time in her life, she was making a truly important decision, even if all the options had been placed before her by other people. She kept Alexander's photograph at the bottom of her bag, but couldn't stop thinking about those grey eyes that seemed to hide secrets as deep as her own. The journey to the Blackwood estate took almost 3 hours, winding through the mountains of the Berkshires until reaching a dirt road that seemed endless. Eleanor observed the landscape gradually change, leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization and entering a wild region where dense forests grew mysteriously on both sides of the road. The driver, a middle-aged man named Sebastian, was cordial but reserved throughout the journey, limiting himself to comments about the weather and the beauty of the region. When they finally saw the gates of the property, Eleanor felt her heart race. 2 enormous stone columns marked the entrance, covered with ivy and topped with family crests, that time had rendered almost illegible. The wrought iron gate opened automatically, as if someone were watching them, and they followed an avenue lined with century-old oaks that formed a green cathedral above their heads. The main house appeared like an apparition among the trees. It was an imposing construction from the early 20th century, with influences of the American colonial revival style, mixed with Art Nouveau elements that must have been modern at the time of its construction. 3 stories of light stone, a wide porch with ornate columns, enormous windows with dark shutters, and a garden that must once have been magnificent, but now grew half wild, with old rose bushes spreading uncontrollably, and a central fountain, covered with moss. Alexander Blackwood was waiting for her on the porch, and the first thing Eleanor noticed was that he was even more impressive in person than in the photograph. Tall, broad shoulders under a white linen shirt, dark pants and barefoot, as if he had just casually left the house to receive her. But it was his eyes that disturbed her most. Grey like melted lead, intense in a way that made her feel as if he could read her most intimate thoughts. He descended the porch steps to greet her, and when he extended his hand to help her out of the car, Eleanor felt an electric current run up her arm the moment their skin touched. Alexander seemed to feel the same thing, because his eyes narrowed slightly, and he released her hand more quickly than would have been natural. His voice was deep, educated, but there was a roughness in his tone that suggested someone who wasn't accustomed to social conversations. He apologized for receiving her alone, explaining that he had dismissed most of the staff years ago, and that now the house was cared for only by Sebastian and his wife, Rose, who had worked for the family for more than 20 years. Alexander led her into the house, and Eleanor immediately felt the weight of history in the walls. The corridors were wide, with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked softly under their steps. Old paintings covered the walls, most family portraits, from different eras, and there was a feeling that time had stopped there decades ago. The smell was of old wood, beeswax, and something more indefinable that she couldn't identify. He took her to the library, an impressive room with shelves that went from floor to ceiling, filled with books in English, French, and Latin. There was an unlit fireplace, leather armchairs worn from use, and a large mahogany desk covered with papers. It was clearly the place where Alexander spent most of his time, and Eleanor could imagine him there, reading by the light of an old lamp, surrounded by the silence and the memories that permeated each object. They sat in opposite armchairs, and for a few minutes remained in silence, studying each other. Alexander seemed to be evaluating not just her appearance, but something deeper, as if looking for signs of who she really was beneath the refined education she had received. Eleanor, for her part, felt strangely comfortable with that scrutiny, as if part of her recognized something familiar in this man who should have been a complete stranger. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. His voice was low, almost intimate, when he began to tell the real story of his family. The Blackwoods had arrived in America in the late 19th century, fleeing scandals in England, and built their fortune through the tea trade, but also through less orthodox methods that he preferred not to detail. The tradition of arranged marriages had begun with his great-grandfather as a way to maintain the purity of the lineage and prevent the fortune from being dispersed among unwanted heirs. He spoke about his late wife, Caroline, who had been chosen for him in the same way that Eleanor was being chosen now. He described a loveless but respectful marriage that had lasted 10 years until the accident that killed her. His voice grew rougher when he mentioned that they never had children, which made the pressure to continue the lineage even greater. Eleanor listened to him, fascinated not just by the words but by the way he spoke. There was a vulnerability hidden behind the formality, a loneliness so deep that she could feel it through the air that separated them. When he finished speaking, she realized there were tears in her own eyes, though she didn't know exactly why. During dinner, served in a formal dining room with a table that could accommodate 20 people, Eleanor and Alexander talked about lighter subjects. He asked about her education, her musical tastes, her favorite books. She discovered that he had graduated in law from Harvard, but had never practiced the profession, preferring to manage the family business and dedicate himself to literature. He had written some books of poetry that were published under a pseudonym, a detail he revealed with some embarrassment, as if it were a shameful secret. Rose had prepared an exquisite menu: grilled salmon with herbs from the garden, mushroom risotto, wild greens, salad, and a dessert of red berries. The wine was a Bordeaux that Alexander explained had been kept by his father for special occasions. Eleanor couldn't help but notice the irony of celebrating what could be the beginning of an arranged marriage, with a drink reserved for important moments. As the night progressed and the wine relaxed their defenses, the conversation became more intimate. Alexander told of the loneliness of the past 2 years, of how Caroline's death had been a relief as much as a tragedy, since they had lived as polite strangers in the same house. He spoke of sleepless nights in the library, of solitary walks through the gardens, of the feeling of serving a perpetual sentence in a golden prison. Eleanor, in turn, shared her memories of the orphanage, the discovery of the world beyond those walls, the feeling of always playing a role she hadn't chosen. She admitted that during the 3 years in Boston, she often felt like a doll being prepared for a show whose script she didn't know. It was when Alexander got up to fetch more wine that Eleanor noticed something strange. On the opposite wall, between 2 old portraits, there was a lighter patch on the paint, as if a painting had been removed recently. When he returned, she asked about it. Alexander was visibly uncomfortable, taking a large sip of wine before answering. There had been a portrait there, he admitted, of Caroline, but also of other women in the family, women who strangely resembled Eleanor. He had ordered all of them removed after his wife's death because he could no longer bear to look at them. There was something in those faces that deeply disturbed him, a repetition that went beyond coincidence. Intrigued, Eleanor insisted on seeing the portraits. Alexander resisted at first, saying they were stored in the attic, and it wasn't worth bothering her with dusty antiques. But she was persuasive, and eventually he yielded, leading her up a narrow staircase to the 3rd floor of the house. The attic was a large space, poorly lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Piles of furniture covered by white sheets created a labyrinth of shadows, and the smell of mold mixed with lavender was almost suffocating. Alexander took her to a corner where several paintings were leaning against the wall, covered by a dark cloth. When he removed the cover, Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. There were 5 portraits of different women, painted in distinct periods, judging by the clothes and the artistic style, but they all had the same face, not similar, identical. The same almond-shaped brown eyes, the same delicate mouth, the same face shape, even the same melancholic expression. It was as if the same person had posed for different artists over a century. Alexander observed her reaction in silence, his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, with a hoarse voice, he explained what he knew. All those women had been wives of men of the Blackwood family. The first, painted in 1890, had been his great-great-grandmother. The second, from 1920, his great-grandmother. And so on, until Caroline, whose image was in the last painting of the sequence. It wasn't a coincidence, he continued. It was part of the ancestral agreement that governed the family's marriages. The Blackwoods always chose women with the same physical type, as if they were trying to recreate a specific feminine ideal. There were documents in the library that suggested a more sinister origin for this tradition, linked to rituals and beliefs that dated back to the first Blackwoods in England. Eleanor touched her own face, feeling as if she were looking at ghosts of herself. Alexander approached from behind her, and she could feel the heat of his body, the masculine smell of his skin mixed with the woody perfume he wore. When he placed his hands on her shoulders, she shuddered, but didn't move away. His voice was a whisper when he asked if she now understood why he had resisted so much the idea of meeting her. It wasn't just because of the barbaric tradition of arranged marriage. It was because he knew that when he saw her, it would be like meeting all those dead women again. And there was something in that pattern that haunted him, a feeling that they were all trapped in a cycle that none of them could break. Eleanor turned in his arms, and for the first time their faces were only inches apart. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the way his lips parted when he realized she wasn't fleeing from his proximity. The moment extended between them, charged with a tension that neither knew how to resolve. The kiss happened like a storm. Without warning, without delicacy, just the urgent need of two bodies that recognized each other in a way that the mind couldn't explain. Alexander held Eleanor's face between his hands, and she felt as if she were drowning and being saved at the same time. His taste was red wine and something darker, more primitive, that made her entire body awaken to sensations she didn't know existed. When they separated, both were breathless. Alexander moved away immediately, running his hands through his hair with a gesture of despair. He apologized, said he shouldn't have done that he was being inappropriate and that she would probably think he was a savage. But Eleanor wasn't thinking any of that. She was thinking about how she wanted him to do it again, about how her whole body was vibrating with an energy she had never experienced. They descended from the attic in silence, but the atmosphere between them had completely changed. It was as if an invisible barrier had been broken, and now every look, every casual movement was charged with meaning. Alexander led her to the room that had been prepared for her, on the second floor, explaining that it was right next to a smaller library where she could find books in case she couldn't sleep. The room was elegant and feminine, with antique furniture, pink silk curtains, and a four-poster bed that seemed to have come out of a fairy tale. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the dresser, and silk robes hanging in the wardrobe. Alexander explained that Rose had chosen everything personally, trying to imagine what a young woman would like. Before saying goodnight, he hesitated at the door, as if he wanted to say something important, but ended up just wishing her good night. Eleanor took a long time to fall asleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the portraits of the women identical to her, felt the taste of Alexander's kiss, thought of his hands on her face. There was something wrong with this whole situation, she knew. It was too unnatural, too arranged, too mysterious. But there was also a magnetic attraction that she couldn't deny, a feeling that she belonged to that place in a way that transcended logic. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep and decided to explore the small library that Alexander had mentioned. She put on one of the silk robes and left the room barefoot, trying not to make noise on the wooden floor. The house at night had a completely different personality. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and there were strange sounds that she couldn't identify. Wood creaking, wind in the windows, something that could be footsteps on the floor below. The smaller library was cozy, with reading chairs and a large window that overlooked the gardens. Eleanor chose a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson and settled into an armchair, but couldn't concentrate on reading. Her thoughts constantly returned to Alexander, to the loneliness she had seen in his eyes, to the way he had resisted the impulse to kiss her until he couldn't anymore. That's when she heard music. Piano, coming from somewhere on the floor below. It was a sad and complex melody, played with a skill that suggested years of practice. Eleanor recognized the piece, a Chopin nocturne that she herself had learned to play in Boston, though never with that emotional intensity. She descended the stairs following the sound, which led her to a room she hadn't seen during the day. It was a music room with a magnificent grand piano in the center, surrounded by shelves with sheet music and some antique instruments. Alexander was seated at the piano, still wearing the same clothes from dinner, but with his shirt unbuttoned and sleeves rolled up. He played with his eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music, and there was an expression on his face that she had never seen before, vulnerable, almost desperate. Eleanor stood at the entrance, not wanting to interrupt, but also unable to move away. There was something hypnotic about the way his fingers moved over the keys, the way his body swayed slightly with the melody. When the music ended, he opened his eyes and saw her there, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Alexander asked if the music had awakened her, and she explained that she already couldn't sleep. He invited her to sit on the piano bench beside him, and when she approached, he smelled her perfume mixed with the scent of the silk robe. It was a dangerous proximity, and they both knew it, but neither made any move to distance themselves. He began to play another piece, this time something softer, and explained that he always played piano when he couldn't sleep, especially since Caroline's death. Music was his way of exorcising the ghosts that tormented him, of giving vent to feelings he couldn't express in any other way. Eleanor heard confessions he had probably never made to anyone, about the guilt he felt over his wife's death, about the constant pressure from the family to continue the lineage, about the loneliness that consumed him day after day. When she placed her hand on his, interrupting the music, Alexander felt an electric current run up his arm. She said she understood his loneliness because she had felt the same thing her entire life. She said that perhaps fate had conspired to bring them together, not because of ancestral traditions, but because they both needed to find someone who understood that specific pain of feeling out of place in the world. This time, it was she who kissed him, gently at first, then with more intensity when she felt him respond. His hands got lost in her hair, and she felt her entire body lean toward him, as if a magnetic force were pulling them together. When they finally separated, Alexander whispered that this was madness, that they barely knew each other, that it was all very complicated. But Eleanor replied that some things didn't need to make sense to be true. Eleanor woke up the next day in her own room, but with the vivid memory of having fallen asleep in Alexander's arms on the library sofa after hours of talking and kissing, like love-struck teenagers. Someone had carried her to her room during the night, probably Alexander himself, and carefully covered her. The memory of the previous night's intimacy made her whole body warm, but also brought a new anxiety. How would he behave in the light of day? Would he regret what had happened? When she went down for breakfast, she found only Rose, who explained that Alexander had left early to take care of business in town and would return only in the late afternoon. The older woman had a maternal manner that immediately put Eleanor at ease, and during the meal she managed to extract some information about the Blackwood family that Alexander hadn't shared. Rose had worked on the property since she was 18, when she married Sebastian. She had known Alexander's mother, an elegant but deeply unhappy woman who died when he was only 15. She spoke about Caroline, the first wife, describing her as a kind but haunted person who, in the last years before her death, had become increasingly reclusive and strange. What disturbed Eleanor most was discovering that Caroline had also been raised in a religious orphanage, chosen by the Blackwood family through the same methods that had been used to find her. And before Caroline, Alexander's previous wife, yes, he had been married twice, also came from a similar background. Both had died in strange circumstances, and neither had ever managed to bear children to continue the lineage. Uneasy with these revelations, Eleanor decided to explore more of the property. The gardens were even more extensive than she had imagined, with paths that got lost in the woods, an artificial lake where black swans swam in perfect circles, and various smaller buildings scattered throughout the grounds. It was in one of these buildings, a kind of abandoned chapel half hidden among the trees, that she made a discovery that would change everything. The chapel was small and damp, with broken stained glass and wooden benches eaten away by time. But what caught her attention was the altar. There was no crucifix or traditional religious images. Instead, there were strange symbols carved into the stone, black candles already melted, and something that looked like dried blood staining the marble surface. Behind the altar, in a small sacristy, she found a collection of objects that made her seriously question her sanity. They were wax dolls, all made in the image of the women in the portraits she had seen in the attic. Each doll was dressed in clothes from different eras, but they all had the same face, the same brown hair, the same eyes painted with a disturbing realism. And in the center of the collection there was a new doll still undressed, but with features that were unmistakably hers. Eleanor ran out of the chapel, her heart beating so hard that she was sure she would faint. She returned to the house in panic, looking for Rose, but found her talking on the phone in a conversation that stopped abruptly when she saw her arrive. The older woman's expression changed completely, and for the first time, Eleanor saw fear in her eyes. When questioned about the chapel, Rose first tried to deny that she knew anything, but eventually admitted that the Blackwood family had traditions that went far beyond arranged marriages. There were ancestral rituals, practices that came from England and were kept in absolute secrecy. The dolls were part of a fertility ritual that was supposed to ensure that the wives would bear healthy heirs. But the ritual never worked, Rose admitted, with tears in her eyes. All the Blackwood wives died before they could get pregnant, or lost their babies in tragic ways. And there were always strange signs before the deaths, recurring nightmares, erratic behavior, the feeling of being watched by invisible presences. Eleanor demanded to see Alexander immediately, but Rose explained that he had lied about going to town. In fact, he had been locked in his office since dawn, after discovering that she had gone out to explore the property. Sebastian had told him about her walks through the gardens, and Alexander panicked, knowing that she would eventually find the chapel. Determined to confront him, Eleanor marched to his office and knocked forcefully on the door. Alexander took several minutes to answer, and when he finally opened it, she could see that he had been drinking. His eyes were red, his shirt wrinkled, and there was an expression of despair on his face that frightened her more than any sinister ritual. He tried to explain, starting several sentences without managing to finish any of them. He said he had never believed in the family traditions, that he considered it all superstition and madness of the ancestors. But he admitted that after Caroline's death, he began to question his own sanity. There were too many signs, too many coincidences, patterns that repeated too precisely to be mere chance. The truth he finally revealed was even worse than Eleanor had imagined. He wasn't just a victim of family traditions, he was an active participant. Each marriage was carefully orchestrated by him and the other surviving members of the family, a desperate attempt to break a curse that had haunted the Blackwoods for generations. The women weren't chosen randomly. They were selected for specific characteristics, raised in controlled environments, and brought to the property as human sacrifices disguised as marriages. Alexander fell to his knees before her, begging for forgiveness, saying that he had truly fallen in love and that now he couldn't bear the idea that something terrible might happen to her. But Eleanor was already backing toward the door, horrified not only by the revelation, but by the realization that she had also fallen in love with the man who might be responsible for her death. Eleanor ran to her room and frantically began to pack, her hands trembling so much that she could barely fold the clothes. She needed to leave immediately before it was too late, before she became another wax doll in the macabre collection in the chapel. But when she tried to call Mrs. Mitchell in Boston, she discovered there was no cell signal on the property, and the house's landline had mysteriously stopped working. Alexander appeared at the door of her room, still staggering slightly from the drink, but with more lucid eyes than before. He begged her to listen to him, explained that he had spent the entire night thinking of a way to break the cursed cycle that had imprisoned his family for generations. He said that was why he had been drinking, not out of cowardice, but because he had finally found the courage to do what he had never been able to do before, defy his own ancestors. She refused to listen to him, demanding that he take her back to Boston immediately. Alexander agreed, but explained that it would be impossible to leave that day because a storm was approaching the mountains, and the dirt road that connected the property to the main highway became impassable when it rained. They would have to wait until the next day at minimum. The storm arrived during the afternoon, turning day into premature night. Lightning cut through the sky at regular intervals, and the wind made the windows of the entire house rattle threateningly. Eleanor locked herself in her room, refusing to dine with Alexander, surviving only on some cookies that Rose had discreetly left at her door, along with a bottle of water. During the night, the nightmares began. Eleanor saw herself walking through the corridors of the house, but not as she really was. She wore a white dress from another era, and her feet didn't touch the ground. Other women walked beside her, all with her face, all whispering words that she couldn't understand. They led her to the chapel, where a male figure waited for her at the altar. It wasn't Alexander, but someone older, more sinister, who smiled with teeth that looked like blades. She woke up screaming and immediately heard footsteps running down the hall. Alexander broke down the door of the room because she had locked it from the inside and found her huddled on the bed in a cold sweat and murmuring disconnected phrases. He approached cautiously, like someone approaching a wounded animal, and when he touched her forehead, she was burning with fever. Rose was called, and together they took care of Eleanor throughout the night. The fever rose and fell without apparent reason, and she raved about dead women, blood rituals, babies crying in hidden places in the house. Alexander didn't leave her bedside for a minute, holding her hand while she fought against invisible enemies. When dawn came, the fever had passed, but Eleanor was exhausted and confused. Alexander explained that this always happened with the women who came to the property, a kind of awakening to the presences that inhabited the house. Caroline had gone through the same thing, as had the others before her. It was as if the property tested whether they were suitable for what was to come. But this time would be different, Alexander promised. He had spent the night researching in the family archives, looking for some way to definitively break the cycle. And he had found something, a clause in the original documents that mentioned the possibility of annulling all ancestral pacts through a purification ritual that had never been attempted before. The ritual would require them to burn all objects related to family traditions, the dolls, the portraits, the ancient documents, even the chapel itself, and more importantly, it would require Eleanor to consciously choose to stay with him, not out of obligation or tradition, but out of true love. Only then could the cycle be broken forever. Eleanor listened to him in silence, still divided between fear and the feelings she had developed for him. There was something in the sincerity of his despair that touched her deeply. He wasn't trying to manipulate her or force her into anything. He was, for the first time, offering a real choice. The road was still impassable because of the previous night's rain, so she would have at least one more day to decide. Alexander respected her space, limiting himself to checking if she needed anything, but without pressing for an answer. Eleanor spent the day exploring the house again, but this time with a different perspective. In the library documents, she found detailed records of all the women who had been brought to the property over the years. Their stories were frighteningly similar. All orphans, all raised in religious institutions, all dead before the age of 25. But she also found something else. Love letters written by the Blackwood men to their wives, letters that revealed that at least some of those marriages had transformed into true love, even though they had begun as cold arrangements. At night, when Alexander was playing piano in the music room, as he had done on the first night, Eleanor went down to meet him. This time she knew exactly what she wanted to say. She wanted to try to break the cycle, not for him, but for all the women who had died before her. She wanted to prove that it was possible to choose love, instead of simply accepting fate. Alexander stopped playing when he saw her, and for the first time in days she saw hope in his eyes. When she said she was willing to try the purification ritual, he took her in his arms and kissed her with a desperate intensity, as if she were the answer to all the prayers he had never dared to make. The purification ritual was to take place on the new moon, which would fall 3 days later. Alexander explained that they would need that time to prepare properly, gathering all the cursed objects and studying the ancestral documents to be sure they would do everything correctly. They would only have one chance. If they failed, the cycle would become even stronger, and Eleanor would probably die in the same way as the others. During those 3 days, their relationship was completely transformed. The proximity of possible death, combined with the emotional intensity of the situation, made them give themselves to each other completely. Alexander told stories of his lonely childhood on the property, raised by distant governesses, while his parents traveled the world trying to escape the responsibilities of the family lineage. Eleanor shared her secret dreams from the orphanage, her fantasies about what it would be like to have a real family, her fears about never finding someone who would love her for who she really was. On the second night, they made love for the first time. It was in the library, after hours of reading documents about ancient rituals, when the sexual tension that had been growing between them finally became unbearable. Alexander was gentle, almost reverent, as if he were touching something sacred. For Eleanor it was a revelation, to discover that her body was capable of feeling pleasure, that intimacy could be beautiful instead of sinful, as she had always been taught. They woke up embraced on the library sofa, covered only by a blanket. that Alexander had pulled over them during the night. Rose found them like that and showed no surprise. She just smiled sadly and brought coffee for both, as if understanding that these might be the last moments of happiness they would have. On the day of the ritual, Eleanor woke up with a strange sensation. It wasn't exactly fear, but a kind of serene determination, as if part of her had always known she would arrive at this moment. She spent the morning preparing. She took a long bath, put on a simple white dress she had found in the wardrobe, which had belonged to Caroline, and braided her hair in a way she didn't know why she knew. Alexander gathered all the cursed objects in the main courtyard of the house. The wax dolls, the attic portraits, piles of ancient documents written in archaic English, jewelry that had belonged to the dead wives, even pieces of carved stone that he had torn from the altar of the abandoned chapel. It was an impressive mountain of family history, decades of sinister traditions that would finally be destroyed. Sebastian and Rose said goodbye to them during the afternoon. The older couple had decided to leave the property forever, regardless of the outcome of the ritual. They had saved enough money over the years to live comfortably away from there, and they didn't want to witness another tragedy. Rose hugged Eleanor with tears in her eyes, whispering a prayer that she couldn't identify. When the new moon arrived, transforming the night into almost total darkness, Alexander and Eleanor walked hand in hand to the courtyard where the pyre had been assembled. They had memorized the words of the purification ritual, written in ancient Latin that Alexander had carefully translated. According to the documents, they would need to voluntarily renounce all inheritance of the Blackwood family, publicly declare their true love for each other, and then burn all the objects while reciting words of banishment. The fire caught quickly, fueled by the dry wood of the dolls and the yellowed paper of the documents. The flames rose high, creating dancing shadows on the walls of the house, and for a moment, Eleanor had the impression of seeing faces in the flames, the women who had died before her, watching with expressions of hope and sadness. As the objects burned, strange things began to happen. The wind increased dramatically, even though there was no forecast for a storm. The windows of the house began to open and close by themselves, creating a deafening noise, and more disturbingly, they began to hear voices, whispers in English, that seemed to come from all directions at once. Alexander held Eleanor's hand more tightly, and together they continued reciting the words of banishment. When they came to the part about declaring true love, he turned to her and, with his voice trembling with emotion, said that he loved her not because of traditions or ancestral agreements, but because she had brought light to his dark life, because she was brave enough to face the curse that had defeated all the others, because she had taught him that it was possible to choose love instead of simply accepting fate. Eleanor responded that she loved him because he had shown her that it was possible to be valued for who she really was, because he hadn't tried to mold her into an idealized version of a woman, but had fallen in love with her strength, her intelligence, her ability to challenge unjust traditions, because together they were stronger than apart. When they finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. The flames of the pyre changed color, going from normal orange to a supernatural blue. The wind stopped abruptly, leaving the night in total silence. And then, one by one, the windows of the house closed gently, as if invisible presences were finally finding peace. Alexander and Eleanor remained embraced, watching the fire consume the last vestiges of the family curse. When the flames finally extinguished, leaving only ashes scattered across the courtyard, they felt a lightness that neither had experienced before. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders, as if they could finally breathe freely. But they still didn't know if the ritual had really worked. They would only discover that with time, observing if the sinister patterns that had tormented the Blackwood family for generations had finally been broken forever. 6 months after the ritual, Eleanor woke up on a September morning with a different sensation in her body. Something had changed, a new fullness that she couldn't completely identify. Alexander was still sleeping beside her in the bed they now shared in the main bedroom of the house, and she took advantage of the moment of silence to observe how the sunlight filtered through the curtains created golden patterns on his relaxed face. The property had transformed since the night of purification. It was as if a dark mist had dissipated, allowing life to flourish there again. The gardens were greener, birds sang more frequently, and even the house seemed more welcoming, with its illuminated corridors and its windows always open to let the fresh air circulate. They had married in a simple registry office in Stockbridge 2 weeks after the ritual, without a party or grand celebration. Only Mrs. Mitchell had attended as a witness, the only person from outside the property who knew the whole story. The housekeeper had cried throughout the ceremony, moved to see Eleanor finally free to choose her own destiny. The adaptation to married life had been more natural than either of them expected. Alexander revealed himself to be an attentive and passionate companion, sharing with her not just the intimate moments, but also the decisions about how to manage the family fortune and the properties scattered throughout the country. He had insisted that she learn about the family business, saying that he wanted a true partner, not just a decorative wife. Eleanor discovered that she had a talent for administration and vision for investments. Together, they had completely reformulated the structure of the Blackwood businesses, selling the rural properties that were associated with ancestral traditions and investing in technology and education. They created a foundation that offered scholarships to young orphans, ensuring that others like her would have opportunities to build their own lives. But on that September morning, Eleanor knew that something else was happening. The morning sickness she had been feeling for a few weeks, combined with the missed period and increased sensitivity in her breasts, pointed to a possibility that both excited and terrified her. She left the bed carefully so as not to wake Alexander, and went to the bathroom, where she had hidden the pregnancy test she had discreetly purchased during a trip to town the previous week. Her hands trembled when she opened the package, because she knew that this result would change everything. All previous Blackwood wives had died before they could bear heirs. If she was pregnant, it would be the first real test that the purification ritual had worked. The 5 minutes of waiting seemed eternal. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror while waiting, noting how her face had changed in recent months. There was a new serenity in her eyes, a confidence she had never possessed before. She was no longer the frightened girl from the orphanage or the manipulated young woman from Boston. She was a woman who had faced her demons and won. When she finally looked at the test, 2 clear lines confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant approximately 6 weeks along. For a few moments, she stood in silence, processing the magnitude of that information. Then, an immense joy took over her chest, mixed with a deep gratitude for having managed to break the cursed cycle that had prevented the other women from living this experience. Alexander woke up when she returned to the bedroom, and immediately noticed that something had changed. Eleanor was radiant, with a smile that illuminated her entire face. When she showed him the test, he remained silent for so long that she began to worry. Then he took her in his arms and began to cry. Tears of relief, of joy, of a liberation that he had waited for his entire life. They spent the entire morning in bed, making plans for the future, choosing possible names, imagining what it would be like to raise a child in that house that was now free from the shadows of the past. Alexander confessed that he had been afraid to suggest having children, because there was still a part of him that feared the curse had not been completely broken. But now, with confirmation of the healthy pregnancy, both felt truly free. They decided to completely renovate the east wing of the house, transforming it into a bright and cheerful space for the child. They would hire new staff, people who didn't carry the weight of the old traditions. They would create a new story for the Blackwood family, based on love and conscious choice. In the afternoon, they walked together to the location where the abandoned chapel had been. Alexander had ordered it completely demolished after the ritual, and now a garden of white roses that Eleanor had planted with her own hands grew there. It was the perfect symbol of transformation, beauty and life flourishing, where before there had been only death and manipulation. Seated on the wooden bench they had placed in the center of the garden, Alexander told Eleanor about the dreams he had had the night before. Dreams of a brown-haired girl running through the gardens, laughing while playing with dogs and cats they hadn't yet adopted. Dreams of happy birthdays, first days of school, graduations, marriages for love. Dreams of a normal family, built on solid foundations of true affection. Eleanor placed her hand on her still flat stomach, imagining the life that was growing inside. It would be a free child who would never know the weight of ancestral traditions or the pain of having fate decided by others. It would grow loved, protected, but also independent, capable of making its own choices and building its own happiness. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, they returned to the house hand in hand. There was still much work to do, doctors to consult, renovations to plan, staff to hire. But for the first time in their lives, both felt that the future was truly theirs to decide. 2 years later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Eleanor watched from the porch of the house as Alexander ran through the garden with Helena, their 1.5-year-old daughter, in his arms. The girl laughed every time he lifted her in the air, her brown curls shining in the sun, and her brown eyes, identical to her mother's, sparkling with pure joy. It was exactly the scene that Alexander had dreamed of, and that had seemed impossible just a few years before. The pregnancy had proceeded without complications, contrary to all ancestral fears. Helena was born on a clear March morning, healthy and perfect, definitively breaking the cycle of death that had haunted the Blackwood women for generations. The birth was attended by the best doctors from Boston, but Eleanor insisted that it take place on the property itself, in the room where she and Alexander had truly fallen in love. Mrs. Mitchell had moved to the estate during the last months of the pregnancy, helping to take care of Eleanor, and then falling hopelessly in love with little Helena. The former housekeeper, who had never married or had children, found in the family she had helped form a second chance to experience motherhood, now as a chosen grandmother. The property had completely transformed. Where before a sepulchral silence reigned, now echoed laughter, music, and animated conversations. They had hired a young team of staff, gardeners, cooks, housekeepers, who brought new life to every corner of the house. The library continued to be Alexander's favorite place, but now it was always full of children's books, piled among the classics, and had a special corner with colorful cushions where Helena liked to read her own made-up stories. The music room had become the heart of the house. Alexander taught piano to Eleanor every afternoon, after Helena fell asleep for her nap, and they spent hours playing duets and composing simple melodies that made their daughter clap her hands and dance. It was a different music from the one he played in his lonely times, cheerful, hopeful, full of life. The family business also prospered under the new administration. The foundation they had created had already benefited more than 100 young orphans, offering not just education but also psychological support and career opportunities. Eleanor made a point of personally knowing each beneficiary, always remembering her own journey from the orphanage to that life of achievements. On that specific afternoon, as she watched her husband and daughter play in the garden, Eleanor felt a deep gratitude for all the choices she had made. She could have fled the property that first night when she discovered the macabre portraits. She could have rejected Alexander when she learned about the ancestral rituals. She could have chosen safety instead of love, but she had chosen to face her fears and fight for a different future. Helena ran to the porch when she saw her mother, climbing the steps with the characteristic determination of a 1.5-year-old child. Eleanor took her in her arms, feeling the sweet smell of her hair and the radiant energy that emanated from her small body. It was impossible to imagine that this happy and healthy child could be a descendant of the same lineage that had produced so many tragedies. Alexander joined them on the porch, and the three sat there watching the sun set over the mountains. It was a daily ritual they had adopted, a moment of contemplation and gratitude that connected them not only to each other, but to the simple beauty of the life they had built together. Helena fell asleep in her mother's arms, and Alexander carried her to the crib in the room next to theirs. When he returned, he found Eleanor still on the porch, lost in thought. She told him that she had received a letter that morning from an 18-year-old girl who had been a beneficiary of the foundation and was now graduating in medicine. The girl wrote to thank her for the opportunity that had changed her life, and mentioned that she dreamed of working with orphan children, continuing the cycle of help she had received. It was exactly what Eleanor had hoped for when they created the foundation, not just to offer opportunities, but to inspire other people to do the same. Instead of the destructive cycle that had governed the Blackwoods for generations, they were creating a constructive cycle of multiplied love and transformed lives. That night, after Helena was sleeping deeply, Alexander and Eleanor made love, with the same passion as the early days, but now tempered with the deep intimacy of those who had faced storms together and chosen to remain side by side. It was a mature love, tested, strengthened by the difficulties overcome. Lying in the darkness afterwards, Alexander whispered that sometimes he still couldn't believe that life was real, that he woke up some mornings expecting to discover that he had dreamed it all. The extraordinary woman at his side, the perfect daughter in the next room, the house full of laughter and music. Eleanor replied that she understood the feeling, because she too sometimes felt that she had received more happiness than she deserved. But Alexander disagreed. He said that she deserved all that and more, because she had had the courage to break chains that seemed unbreakable. She had chosen love instead of fear, hope instead of despair, struggle instead of resignation. And in making these choices, she had freed not only herself but also him and all future generations of Blackwoods. As Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms, she thought of the long journey she had traveled from that frightened girl at the orphanage to the fulfilled woman she was now. She had discovered that true love wasn't something that happened by chance, but something that was chosen every day, even when it was difficult, even when it required sacrifices, even when it seemed impossible. And most important of all, she had broken the cycle. Helena would grow up free, loved, able to choose her own destiny, and if one day she had children, they too would grow up free,